At the beginning of the course, I had very little experience with Adobe Photoshop and InDesign, so my skills were very, very bare minimum. As I progressed through the course, I found it much easier to use Photoshop and InDesign, so that I could do basic things like changing the stroke on a piece of text or adding a shadow to an image. By the end of my preliminary exercise, I found that it was much easier to use Photoshop and InDesign for my main task. I'd learnt that there were a lot of shortcuts that you could use when transferring from Photoshop to InDesign, rather than taking the lengthy processes I'd taken while doing my preliminary task. By the end of my preliminary task, I'd learned a lot about the software and hardware I had to use when doing my main task. For instance, I learned a lot about the DSLRs, as I found out that it was much easier to use the DSLRs than the digital cameras we'd used in the preliminary exercises. For instance, the DSLRs came with their own flash, which meant that in low light areas, it was a lot easier to get decent lighting. I also learnt a lot about how to use InDesign and Photoshop, as it meant that I could do the Photoshop side of things a lot quicker than I could have done in the preliminary exercise for my main task. By the end of my main task, I'd found it a lot easier to use InDesign and Photoshop, to a point where I could be considered decent at using them. However, I still struggle with some of the more advanced things, but I find it a lot easier to make the magazines and do the headers and the mastheads now in Photoshop and InDesign. I've also learnt a lot on how to use the DSLRs for the main task, which means that if I was to do this again in future, it would be a lot easier and a lot quicker to use the DSLRs than it has been this time.